Close your eyes for a moment and picture winter in medieval Scandinavia. Not the Hollywood version with bare-chested warriors strutting through snow like it's a mild spring day, but the actual, bone-deep reality of surviving months of darkness in a world without central heating, without grocery stores, without any of the creature comforts we take for granted today. The sun barely crawls above the horizon for a few precious hours each day. In the far north of Norway, it doesn't rise at all for weeks on end. Temperatures plunge well below freezing, ice locks the fjords, snow buries the landscape, and you're living in what's essentially an elaborate dirt-floored barn with your entire extended family, a few cows, maybe some sheep, and whatever food you managed to put away before the frost came. This was winter in Viking times, and somehow the Norse people didn't just survive it. They thrived through it, built their culture around it, and even found ways to celebrate in the midst of it. The question isn't whether they were tough enough to handle the cold. The question is, how did they actually do it? What were the real techniques, the daily struggles, the small victories that got them through to spring? Today we're going to step into that world. We're going to explore what winter was genuinely like for the Vikings, based on archaeological evidence, historical sources, and the environmental realities they faced. No romanticised nonsense. Just the fascinating, often brutal, occasionally surprising truth about how medieval Scandinavians conquered winter. Let's start with something that might shock you. The Vikings weren't actually living through some nightmarish Ice Age wasteland. In fact, during much of the Viking Age, which stretched from roughly 800 to 1050 CE, the climate was warmer than you might expect. Historians and climate scientists call this period the medieval warm period. From about 900 to 1300 CE, temperatures across the northern hemisphere were somewhat higher than they had been in previous centuries. In Greenland, where Eric the Red famously established Viking settlements, summer temperatures hovered around 10 degrees Celsius, or about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. That's similar to what southern Greenland experiences today. Archaeological evidence from lake sediments and tree rings confirms that this relatively balmy period allowed the Norse to sail more easily, grow crops in marginal areas, and expand their settlements to places that would become uninhabitable just a few centuries later. But here's the thing about averages. They mask enormous variation. Yes, the overall climate trend was warmer, but that doesn't mean every year was mild. Far from it. The medieval warm period wasn't uniformly warm across all regions, and it certainly didn't eliminate winter. In fact, for most Vikings living in mainland Scandinavia, Iceland, or the far northern reaches of their territory, winter was still an absolute beast to contend with. Before the Viking Age truly began, Scandinavia had endured what scientists call the Dark Ages cold period, which lasted from roughly 300 to 800 CE. Volcanic eruptions in the year 536, possibly in Iceland or somewhere in the northern hemisphere, created a massive dust cloud that darkened the sun and caused temperatures to plummet across Europe. In some areas, temperatures dropped by as much as 4 degrees Celsius. Imagine already living in a cold climate, and then having the temperature drop another 4 degrees. Crops failed, people starved. In Sweden's upland region, archaeological evidence shows that nearly 75% of villages were abandoned during this catastrophic period. People either died from starvation, froze to death, or fled to areas where conditions were marginally less horrific. This cold spell lasted for decades and fundamentally reshaped Scandinavian society. When summer finally returned to the north, the social structure had changed. Leaders surrounded themselves with heavily armed war bands. People became more territorial, more willing to fight over diminished resources. Some historians believe this period of climate-induced trauma and social upheaval helped create the more aggressive, expansionist Viking culture that would emerge in the late 700s. Climate change, in other words, may have helped forge the Viking Age itself. But even during the warmer centuries that followed, winter in Scandinavia was no joke. Modern Norway, Sweden and Denmark experience winter temperatures that regularly drop below freezing. In northern Norway, temperatures can plunge to -30 or even -40 degrees Celsius during extreme cold snaps. Iceland, sitting in the North Atlantic, gets battered by storms that can dump enormous amounts of snow and bring winds that make the already cold temperatures feel absolutely savage. The Viking Age climate might have been warmer on average, but winter was still winter. The sun still disappeared for months. The ground still froze solid. The sea still became too dangerous to navigate. And here's another critical point. The Vikings lived during a time when they had to be exquisitely attuned to climate variations because their survival depended on it. A wet autumn could mean hay didn't dry properly, which meant livestock wouldn't have enough food for winter, which meant animals would die or have to be slaughtered early, which meant less food for people. A late spring could delay planting and doom the next harvest before seeds even went into the ground. An exceptionally harsh winter could kill people directly through cold exposure, or indirectly through depleted food stores and increased disease among weakened populations. The Vikings weren't fighting some abstract concept of winter. They were fighting specific, tangible challenges. The darkness itself was psychologically grueling. In the northernmost Viking settlements, polar night meant the sun didn't rise at all for weeks. Even in southern Norway or Denmark, winter, days were short with sunlight limited to just a few hours. You woke in darkness, worked in twilight, and went to sleep in darkness. This wasn't just depressing. It affected your body's ability to produce vitamin D, impacted your circadian rhythms, and made every task more difficult. The cold was relentless. Without modern insulation or heating systems, keeping warm required constant vigilance and enormous amounts of fuel. Wood had to be gathered, dried, and stored. Fires had to be maintained day and night. Clothing had to be made, worn, and constantly repaired. Your survival quite literally depended on staying warm enough to avoid hypothermia while not consuming so much fuel that you ran out before spring. Sea ice was another major factor. The Viking economy and culture were built around maritime trade and travel. Longships were their highways. But in winter, sea ice could make navigation impossible or deadly. Storms in the North Atlantic and Norwegian Sea were violent enough to sink ships and drown entire crews. This meant that winter effectively shut down raiding, trading, and most forms of long-distance travel. Communities became isolated, cut off from each other for months at a time. Different regions within the Viking world experienced winter differently. In Denmark, which is further south, and influenced by maritime air masses, winters were comparatively mild. Snow fell, temperatures dropped below freezing, but the extremes weren't as severe as in Norway or Sweden. Danish Vikings could often continue some outdoor activities throughout winter. In Norway, particularly in the western fjord regions, winters brought deep snow and bitter cold. But the Gulf Stream's moderating influence kept coastal areas from becoming completely uninhabitable. The fjords themselves provided some shelter from the worst storms. In Sweden, especially in the interior regions away from the coast, winters were long, dark, and brutally cold. Temperatures stayed below freezing for months. Lakes and rivers froze solid, which actually provided opportunities for travel by ice skate and ski, but also meant that fresh water sources could be difficult to access. Iceland presented its own unique challenges. Settled by Norwegian Vikings starting in the late 800s, Iceland combined extreme isolation with a harsh climate. Winters brought snow, ice, and violent storms. The island had no native trees to speak of, which meant wood for building and fuel was scarce and precious. Icelanders had to import timber or make do with driftwood that washed ashore. They burned peat and dried dung for fuel. Their winters were defined by scarcity and the constant threat of running out of essential resources. Greenland, the furthest western Viking outpost, was paradoxically both blessed and cursed by its climate. During the medieval warm period, the southern tip of Greenland was genuinely habitable. Viking settlers raised livestock, grew limited crops, and built thriving communities. But Greenland had no forests whatsoever. every piece of wood had to be imported from Scandinavia or scavenged from driftwood. When the climate began cooling again in the later medieval period, Greenland's Viking settlements couldn't adapt. Trade with Norway became sporadic and then stopped. The warming period that had made settlement possible ended, glaciers advanced, and by the mid-1400s the last Vikings in Greenland had either died, fled, or been absorbed by Inuit populations. Climate variability quite literally determined whether people lived or died on Greenland. Archaeological evidence gives us hard data about these climate patterns. Scientists analysing ice cores from Greenland can see layers of volcanic ash from the 536 eruption. They can measure oxygen isotopes in ancient ice to reconstruct temperature changes over centuries. Lake sediments from Norway and Sweden contain pollen, which tells us what plants were growing in different periods, and thus what the climate conditions must have been like. Tree rings from ancient wood preserved in bogs show us that some years had longer growing seasons, while others were stunted by cold and lack of sunlight. One particularly revealing piece of evidence comes from chironomid analysis. Chironomids are a type of lake fly whose larvae are preserved in lake sediments. By analysing the oxygen isotopes in their exoskeletons, scientists can reconstruct past temperatures with remarkable precision. Studies of southern Greenland sediments show that temperatures during the Norse settlement period were indeed warmer than the surrounding centuries, but also that the climate was exceptionally erratic near the end of the settlement period, with wild swings between record highs and record lows. This instability likely made farming and planning impossible, contributing to the eventual abandonment of Greenland. The Vikings themselves were acute observers of weather and climate patterns. The Icelandic sagas and medieval Norwegian texts contain detailed descriptions of particularly harsh winters, unusually mild years, and the consequences of climate variations. The saga of Gisli describes an outlaw building a hidden shelter to survive winter while on the run. The descriptions of cold, isolation, and the constant struggle to stay warm ring true even today. The Greenland sagas mention settlers relying on their fire-making skills to survive brutal winters where daylight was as rare as fresh vegetables. These weren't just literary flourishes, they were survival manuals passed down through oral tradition and eventually written down. Understanding the actual climate the Vikings faced matters because it shapes everything else about their winter survival strategies. They weren't fighting an endless uniform deep freeze. They were adapting to a climate that varied by region, by year, and even by season within each winter. They had to be flexible, resourceful, and constantly prepared for the possibility that this winter might be worse than the last. So when we talk about Viking winter, we're talking about a specific set of environmental challenges. Darkness that lasted for months, cold that could kill you if you weren't prepared, ice that locked down travel routes, storms that could destroy your shelter if it wasn't built properly. Scarcity of resources that meant careful planning in autumn could mean the difference between eating well all winter and starving by early spring. This was the reality, and within this reality, the Vikings developed an intricate, sophisticated culture of winter survival that touches every aspect of their daily lives. The centre of Viking winter survival was the longhouse. Not a house in the way we think of houses today, as individualised units where nuclear families live in relative privacy. The longhouse was a communal fortress against winter, a multifunctional space where extended families lived, worked, ate, slept, and endured the long dark months together. Picture a building that's somewhere between 15 and 75 metres long, roughly 50 to 250 feet, though most were on the shorter end of that range. The width was typically about 5 to 7 metres, maybe 15 to 25 feet. The shape was distinctive, long and narrow, with walls that bowed outward at the centre, making the building wider in the middle than at the ends. This wasn't just aesthetic choice. The shape mimicked a ship's hull, which Vikings knew intimately from their seafaring culture. The curved design also helped the structure shed snow and distribute weight, preventing roof collapse under heavy winter snow loads. The construction varied based on available materials and the wealth of the family. In Norway and Sweden, where timber was abundant, longhouses had wooden frames supported by 2 rows of vertical posts running the length of the building. These posts held up the roof beams. The walls might be made of vertical wooden planks driven into the ground, or horizontal logs stacked like a cabin, or wattle and daub, which is a lattice of wooden strips plastered with a mixture of clay, mud, straw, and dung. In Iceland and Greenland, where trees were scarce or non-existent, walls were built from stacked turf, thick blocks of earth, and grass roots that provided excellent insulation. The turf was cut in rectangular blocks and layered like bricks. A wooden frame, often made from precious imported timber or driftwood, held the structure together and supported the roof. Roofs were equally variable. Some longhouses had wooden shingle roofs. Others used thatch made from straw or reeds. Many used turf, especially in Iceland, creating the iconic green-roofed buildings that still exist in reconstructions today. Turf roofs were heavy, which meant the supporting structure had to be strong, but they provided outstanding insulation. The turf acted as a natural blanket, keeping heat inside during winter and keeping the building cooler during the brief summer. Snow piling up on the roof in winter, actually, added extra insulation, turning the longhouse into something like a semi-buried igloo. Inside the longhouse, the layout was carefully designed for winter survival. The building was divided into several rooms or sections, separated by interior walls or simply by wooden posts and hanging curtains. At the centre of the main hall was the most important feature, the hearth. This wasn't a small fireplace in the corner. This was a long rectangular fire pit dug into the dirt or stone floor running down the centre of the room. Some longhouses had a single central hearth serving the entire hall. Others had smaller individual fires in different sections. The fire burning in that hearth was sacred. It was life. It provided warmth, obviously, but also light, cooking heat, and a focal point for social interaction. The fire was tended constantly. In many households, it was the duty of the matriarch or the women of the family to ensure the fire never went out. Letting the hearth fire die in winter wasn't just inconvenient. It could be deadly. Relighting a fire from scratch using fire steel, flint and tinder was possible, but took time and skill. If the fire went out in the middle of a winter night during a storm, restarting it in a cold, dark longhouse could be a genuine emergency. Archaeological excavations of Viking longhouses have found fire-making kits, small pouches containing a curved steel striker, a piece of flint, and carefully prepared tinder made from dried moss, birch bark, or fungi like amadou. These kits were prized possessions, carried on person or kept close at hand because they were literally life-saving tools. The smoke from the fire had to go somewhere, and here's where longhouse design got clever. There were no chimneys in the way we think of them. Instead, smoke rose naturally and escaped through gaps in the roof thatching, or through specially designed smoke holes. These holes could be opened or closed depending on wind conditions and weather. On a calm day, you'd open the smoke holes wide to let smoke escape and light pour in. During a storm, you might partially close them to keep wind and snow out while still allowing some ventilation. Modern reconstructions of longhouses show that when smoke holes are properly positioned, the interior isn't as smoky and dim as you might imagine. Natural light filtering through the holes combined with firelight could make the space surprisingly bright during daylight hours. At night, or during the darkest winter days, additional lighting came from oil lamps. These were simple clay or stone dishes filled with cod liver oil, seal oil or whale oil, with a wick made from twisted moss or plant fibres. Fish oil lamps, in particular, were common in coastal Viking communities. They didn't produce bright light by modern standards, but a few lamps placed strategically around the longhouse could provide enough illumination for close-up work like sewing, tool repair or carving. The smell, though, must have been something else. Imagine a combination of wood smoke, burning fish oil, unwashed bodies. Bathing in winter was rare and difficult. Animal dung from livestock at one end of the building, and food cooking over an open fire. The longhouse would have had a distinctive pungent smell that we would probably find overwhelming, but the Vikings would have considered normal. Along the walls of the longhouse ran built-in benches. These served multiple functions. They were sitting platforms during the day where people could work, eat, or socialise. At night, they became beds. People would lay out straw mattresses or furs on the benches and sleep there, sometimes several people to a bench depending on the size of the family. The space underneath the benches was used for storage. Wooden chests, pottery vessels, barrels of preserved food, tools and personal belongings were tucked away under there. Some longhouses even had loft spaces at the ends accessed by ladders, which could be used for additional storage or sleeping space for children or slaves, though lofts were often too smoky for comfortable sleeping. One end of the longhouse, and sometimes part of the central hall, was reserved for livestock during winter. If you had separate outbuildings like barns or stables, you might keep animals there, but many farms brought animals directly into the longhouse. Cows, sheep, goats, and occasionally horses would be housed in stalls at one end. This served two purposes. First, it kept the animals from freezing to death, which protected a valuable food source and investment. Second, and this is important, the animals generated body heat. Large mammals like cows produce a surprising amount of warmth. Having several animals at one end of your longhouse, separated from the human living area by a wall or partition, meant you had a living furnace contributing to the overall temperature of the building. Yes, this also meant living with animal smells, noise, and waste. But when the alternative was animals freezing to death and you freezing to death, the trade-off was obvious. Archaeological evidence from preserved longhouse sites gives us incredible detail about how these buildings were constructed and used. At Stung in Iceland, a farmstead buried by volcanic ash in the year 1104, archaeologists found a perfectly preserved longhouse. The turf walls were still standing. The stone hearth was intact. You could see where the benches had been, where the partitions separated the animal stalls from the human living area, even where the privy was located in an attached room. At Borg in Norway's Lofoten Islands, excavations revealed the foundations of one of the largest Viking chieftains' halls ever found, stretching over 80 metres long. This was clearly not a normal farmhouse, but a high-status building designed to host large gatherings and feasts. The size and construction quality showed that wealth and power were reflected in the buildings people lived in. Inside the longhouse, especially during winter, privacy was essentially non-existent. You were living in extremely close quarters with your extended family, maybe some thralls or slaves if you were wealthy, possibly guests or travellers who showed up needing shelter. Everyone could hear everyone else's conversations. Everyone knew everyone else's business. People ate together, worked together, slept in the same room together, with nothing but a hanging curtain or wooden partition for any semblance of separation. For months at a time you barely left this space. You woke in the longhouse, spent your day in the longhouse, went to sleep in the longhouse. Going outside meant bundling up against brutal cold, so most activities shifted indoors. The longhouse became your entire world. This enforced closeness had profound social effects. It created strong family bonds, but also inevitable tensions. The sagas are full of stories about feuds that developed during long winters spent in close confinement, where minor irritations festered into violent conflicts. But it also meant that knowledge, skills, and stories were constantly being shared. Children learned by watching adults work. The young heard tales from the old. Crafting techniques, songs, and histories were passed down not through formal education, but through the daily rhythm of communal life in the longhouse. The furniture inside a longhouse was minimal. Besides the built-in benches, there might be a few storage chests or trunks, usually made from wood, and sometimes decorated with carvings or iron fittings if the family had wealth. Tables weren't permanent fixtures. When it was time to eat, wooden planks would be set on trestles to create a temporary table, then disassembled and stored after the meal. The wealthiest families might own a carved wooden bed, which was a significant status symbol but most people slept on the benches with simple bedding made of straw stuffed into cloth sacks, covered with wool blankets and furs if you could afford them. Wealthier families would decorate their longhouse walls with wool textiles. We're talking about woven wall hangings, sometimes with patterns or simple designs. These weren't just decorative, they added an extra layer of insulation against cold drafts seeping through the walls. They also absorbed some smoke and dampened sound in what would otherwise have been an echo-filled space. The creation of these textiles was itself a winter activity, something we'll explore more when we talk about indoor work. Some longhouses had additional rooms or attached buildings. A separate room might serve as a dedicated workspace for specific crafts. Another might be a storage room for precious items or food that needed to be kept particularly secure. Some wealthy farms had separate bathhouses, small buildings with steam baths similar to modern saunas, though these were used less frequently in winter because of the difficulty in heating them and the danger of going outside wet and then getting chilled. The entrances to longhouses were carefully designed to prevent heat loss. Doors were often double doors or had an entry passage that created an airlock effect. You'd open the outer door, step into a small vestibule area, close the outer door, then open the inner door to enter the main hall. This prevented blasts of freezing air from rushing directly into the living space every time someone came or went. Some longhouses had doors at both ends, which allowed for through ventilation when needed in warmer weather. But in winter, one end would typically be kept closed and sealed. Archaeological analysis of longhouse floors has revealed fascinating details about daily life. The floors were usually packed earth or stone, occasionally wooden planks in wealthier homes. Over time, layers of organic material built up, ash from the hearth that was scattered on the floor to absorb moisture and smells, food scraps that were tossed into the fire or onto the floor, straw from bedding and general debris. These layers, when excavated carefully, tell archaeologists what people were eating, what tools they were using, even what time of year certain activities occurred. Bones from butchered animals show meat consumption. Fish bones indicate seafood in the diet. Fragments of ceramics show what kind of pottery was being used. Scraps of textile reveal clothing styles and weaving techniques. The longhouse was more than just a building. It was a survival system, a social structure, and a cultural statement all in one. It represented the Viking understanding that winter was not a time for individual survival, but for communal endurance. The longhouse brought people and animals together, pooled resources and body heat, and created a space where the clan could weather the worst that winter threw at them. It was crowded, smoky, smelly, and probably claustrophobic by modern standards, but it worked. It kept people alive through months of darkness and cold, and in its own way, it became the crucible where Viking culture was forged, where stories were told, skills were taught, and the bonds of family and community were strengthened through shared hardship. If the longhouse was the Vikings' fortress against winter, their clothing was their personal armour. And unlike Hollywood's version of Viking fashion, which seems to consist of bare chests, leather vests, and impractical helmets, actual Viking winter clothing was all about layers, insulation, and practical survival. The foundation of Viking clothing was wool. Not just any wool, but wool from hardy Scandinavian sheep that had evolved to survive northern climates. These sheep produced thick lanolin-rich fleece that was naturally water-resistant and incredibly warm. The lanolin, a waxy substance in sheep's wool, meant that even when wool got wet, it retained much of its insulating properties. This was crucial in a damp, cold climate where you might get caught in rain or snow. Viking women spent enormous amounts of time processing wool. After sheep were sheared in spring, the wool had to be cleaned, which meant washing out dirt, debris, and some of the excess lanolin. Then it was carded, which involved combing the fibres with specialised tools to align them and remove any remaining tangles. Archaeological finds have uncovered wool combs made from wood or bone, with long teeth designed to pull fibres straight. Once carded, the wool was spun into yarn using a drop spindle, a simple but effective tool consisting of a stick with a weight at one end. You'd pull wool fibres from a bundle, twist them into thread, and let the weighted spindle drop and spin, creating yarn through its momentum. This was work that could be done while walking, while watching children, while chatting with neighbours. It was constant, ongoing labour that filled spare moments. The spun yarn then went to weaving. Viking looms were upright frames, often set up permanently in the longhouse. Warp threads hung vertically, weighted at the bottom with stones or ceramic weights. The weaver would pass the weft thread horizontally through the warp, creating fabric. This was skilled work that required attention and practice. The fabric produced could vary from coarse, thick cloth, suitable for outer garments and blankets, to finer, tighter weaves for clothing that sat closer to the skin. Once you had fabric, you could make clothes. For men, the basic outfit consisted of layers. The innermost layer was usually a linen undershirt or tunic. Linen, made from flax plants, was softer and more comfortable against skin than wool. It was also easier to wash. Over this went a wool tunic, a long garment that reached to about the knees, with long sleeves that could be pushed up when working or pulled down for warmth. The tunic was typically belted at the waist with a leather belt, which not only kept the garment from flapping around, but also served as a place to hang tools, a knife, a pouch, or other everyday items. Trousers were the next layer. Viking men wore wool or linen trousers that varied from loose-fitting to relatively tight, depending on personal preference and regional style. These had no pockets and were held up with a drawstring or by being tucked into the belt. In winter, trousers might be lined or made from thicker wool. Some men wore leg wraps, long strips of wool cloth wound from ankle to knee, providing extra insulation for the legs and helping to keep trousers in place. Leg wraps also allowed you to adjust the tightness and coverage based on how cold it was. Over everything went a cloak. This was a rectangular or semicircular piece of thick wool, often made from the heaviest, densest fabric the family could produce. The cloak was fastened at one shoulder with a brooch or pin, leaving one arm free for work or weapon use while the other side of the cloak could be wrapped around the body. Cloaks were essential. They provided an extra layer of insulation, blocked wind, and could be pulled up over the head as a makeshift hood in bad weather. Wealthier Vikings might have fur-lined cloaks, which added both warmth and status. The type of fur mattered. Bear, wolf, or fox fur was prestigious and expensive. Sheepskin was more common and affordable, but still effective. For women, the clothing system was similar in principle but different in practice. The base layer was a linen underdress or shift, a long garment that provided a soft washable layer next to the skin. Over this went a wool dress, and over that an apron dress called a hangarock or smocker. This was a distinctive piece of Viking female clothing, a sleeveless overdress held up by two straps that connected to oval brooches at the shoulders. The brooches weren't just functional. They were often beautifully crafted from bronze, silver, or even gold if you were wealthy, decorated with intricate patterns or animal designs. The brooches were connected by strings of beads, which added decoration and also had symbolic or practical purposes. Some beads were made from glass, amber, or precious stones. Others might include items like keys, showing the woman's role as keeper of the household. Women also wore cloaks for warmth, though theirs were typically fastened at the front or with a different style of brooch than men used. Like men, women would layer their clothing. In winter, you might wear multiple underdresses, extra shawls, and heavier wool outer garments. The key was trapping air between layers, which created insulation. Footwear was critical. Viking shoes were typically made from leather using a construction method called the turnshoe technique. The shoe was stitched inside out, then turned right side out so the seams were on the inside, creating a smooth exterior that was more water resistant. Shoes were generally ankle height, though boots also existed. The leather was relatively soft, which meant shoes wore out quickly, often lasting only a few months with regular use. Wealthier individuals might have multiple pairs. Poorer people might have one pair that they'd repair repeatedly, or if they absolutely couldn't afford shoes, they'd stuff their feet with hay or moss for insulation and wrap them in cloth or scraps of leather. In the coldest weather, shoes and boots might be lined with fur or stuffed with extra wool or straw for insulation. Vikings also knew about the importance of keeping feet dry. Wet feet in freezing temperatures led to frostbite quickly, so extra care was taken to waterproof footwear with animal fat or wax treatments. Sealskin, when available, was prized for boots because it was naturally waterproof and warm, though it was expensive. Head coverings were essential in winter. Simple wool caps were common. Some people wore hoods that covered the head and shoulders, providing protection from wind and snow. The famous Skjoldhamn hood, discovered in a Norwegian bog and dating to around the year 1000, shows what Viking cold-weather headgear could look like: a pointed fitted hood that covered the entire head and neck, with a face opening and a long tail that could be wrapped around as extra protection. Scarves, face wraps, and other head coverings were also used, all made from wool and often using a technique called nail binding, a precursor to knitting that created stretchy, warm fabric from a single thread using a needle. Mittens and gloves were made using the same nail binding technique, or sewn from wool, leather or fur. For the coldest weather, fur mittens were ideal. The fur created air pockets that trapped heat, and a good pair of fur mittens could keep hands functional even in brutally cold conditions. Some mittens had a simple thumb hole and a single compartment for fingers, which wasn't as flexible as individual finger gloves, but was warmer because fingers could share heat. The Vikings understood the principle of layering long before modern outdoor gear companies marketed it. Multiple thin layers trap more air and provide better insulation than a single thick layer. They also allow you to adjust your clothing based on activity level. If you're working hard and generating body heat, you can remove a layer to prevent sweating, which would then chill you when you stopped moving. If you're sitting still by the fire or outside in extreme cold, you can pile on layers to maximize warmth. Colour and decoration in Viking clothing varied based on wealth and social status. The poorest people wore undyed wool in its natural colours: white, grey, brown, or black, depending on the sheep. Wealthier individuals could afford dyed fabrics. Vikings used natural dyes from plants, roots, and lichens to create colours. Madder root produced reds. Woad created blues. Various plants yielded yellows, greens, and browns. Achieving bright, saturated colours required multiple dyeing processes and was expensive, so vivid clothing was a status symbol. Decorated clothing was another mark of status. Tablet weaving, a technique that created narrow decorative bands with complex patterns, was used to trim the edges of tunics, cloaks, and other garments. These bands might feature geometric patterns, animal motifs, or runic inscriptions. Embroidery, though more time-consuming, could add elaborate decoration to the clothing of the wealthy. For most people, though, clothing was practical and plain. You had a set of clothes that you wore daily, and you expected them to last. When they wore out or tore, you patched them. When they were beyond patching, you might cut them up and reuse the fabric for something else. Clothing production was primarily women's work, which meant women had enormous economic importance. A woman who was skilled at spinning, weaving, sewing, and dyeing could provide her family with warm, well-made clothing that could mean the difference between comfort and suffering during winter. The sagas frequently mention women's textile skills, both as a practical necessity and as a source of family pride. Some women were so skilled that their work became trade goods. High-quality wool cloth, particularly the famous Icelandic vadmal, was exported and used as a form of currency. A well-made cloak could be traded for other goods or services. Let me be crystal clear about something. The idea of Vikings running around in freezing weather in minimal clothing, which you see constantly in movies and TV shows, is absurd. Real Vikings bundled up. They wore layers of wool, wrapped themselves in furs and cloaks, covered their heads, protected their hands and feet, and did everything possible to stay warm. A bare-chested Viking in winter wouldn't last a day. They'd be dealing with hypothermia within hours, frostbite shortly after, and death if they didn't get warm fast enough. Archaeological finds support this picture of practical layered clothing. Textile fragments recovered from graves, ship burials, and bog preservation show fine weaving, evidence of multiple layers, and remains of fur trim and linings. The Herjolfsnes finds from Greenland, a cemetery site where clothing was preserved in permafrost, revealed complete outfits from the medieval period showing how Vikings actually dressed. These weren't fantasy costumes. They were wool tunics, layered dresses, hoods, and practical cold weather gear designed to keep people alive. Maintaining clothing in winter was an ongoing task. Wool garments needed to be kept relatively clean to maintain their insulating properties, though washing in winter was difficult because water had to be heated and wet clothes took forever to dry in cold weather. Instead, people would shake out garments, air them by the fire and brush off dirt and debris. Repairs were constant. Sewing was an everyday activity. A tear in your tunic or a hole in your trousers couldn't wait until spring to fix because you needed every bit of insulation you could get. The work of creating and maintaining clothing filled enormous amounts of time, particularly for women. From shearing sheep to processing wool to spinning to weaving to sewing to repairing, the cycle never stopped. And this labour wasn't optional, it was essential to survival. Your clothing in winter was your protection against the elements. Without it, you died. With good clothing carefully made and maintained, you could not just survive but work, travel and function through even the harshest weather. Let me paint you a picture of autumn on a Viking farm. The harvest is coming in. Grain is being threshed and stored. Animals are being slaughtered because there's no way to feed the entire herd through winter. Women are working frantically to preserve meat and fish. Men are hunting and fishing while the weather still allows it. Everyone, and I mean everyone, is obsessed with one question. Do we have enough food to make it to spring? Because here's the brutal reality of Viking winter. There was no growing food for months. No fresh vegetables, no fruit, no grain being harvested. The ground was frozen solid. The only food you had was what you'd managed to put away during the warmer months, plus whatever you could hunt or catch during winter itself, which was difficult and dangerous in extreme weather. Vikings preserved food through several main methods: drying, smoking, salting, and fermentation. Each method had advantages and requirements. Drying worked for fish, and some meats. You'd hang fish on wooden racks outdoors where wind and sun could desiccate them, creating stockfish, dried cod that could last for months or even years if kept dry. The process required specific weather conditions, cold enough to prevent rotting, but dry enough to actually remove moisture from the fish. Iceland and Norway's coastal climates were ideal for this. The constant wind helped dehydration. The cold prevented bacterial growth. During medieval times, Norwegian dried cod became a major export product, shipped all over Europe where it was valued as a reliable protein source that could be stored and transported without refrigeration. Smoking meat was another preservation method. You'd build or dig a smokehouse, hang strips of meat from racks, and maintain a low, smoky fire beneath them for days or even weeks. The smoke contained compounds that inhibited bacterial growth, while the heat gradually dried out the meat, making it inhospitable to the microorganisms that caused rot. Smoked meat had a distinctive flavour, which was fortunate because you'd be eating a lot of it. Pork, beef, mutton, and game meats could all be smoked. The process required constant attention. The fire had to be kept at the right temperature, hot enough to smoke effectively but not so hot that it cooked the meat too fast, which would make it tough and dry on the outside while remaining moist and prone to spoiling on the inside. Salting was perhaps the most reliable preservation method, but also the most resource-intensive. Salt was precious. It had to be obtained through trade or in coastal areas through evaporating seawater, which was labour-intensive and produced relatively small amounts. To salt meat or fish, you'd pack it in layers with salt, which drew out moisture and created an environment where bacteria couldn't survive. Salted meat and fish could last through winter and into the following summer if stored properly. The downside was that salt-preserved food was, unsurprisingly, incredibly salty. Before eating, you'd need to soak it in water to rehydrate it and leach out some of the salt, which took time and planning. Fermentation was used for dairy products and some other foods. Skyr, an Icelandic cultured milk product that's similar to yogurt, has been made since Viking times. The fermentation process preserved milk and created a nutritious, protein-rich food that could be stored through winter. Sour milk, another fermented dairy product, was also common. These foods weren't just preservation strategies, they were important sources of probiotics and nutrients during a season when fresh food was unavailable. Grains were stored in wooden bins, ceramic vessels, or underground pits lined with stones. Keeping grain dry was critical. Moisture led to mould and rot, which could destroy an entire winter's supply of food. Some farms built dedicated storage houses, small buildings specifically for keeping food secure and dry. Others used the space under sleeping benches in the longhouse, or dug storage pits into the floor, sealing them with wooden covers. Barley was the main grain in much of Scandinavia, though wheat, oats and rye were also grown in areas with suitable climates. Grain could be ground into flour and made into bread, porridge, or gruel. Bread wasn't the fluffy yeasted loaves we're used to today. Viking bread was typically flatbread or dense, unleavened loaves that were filling and could be stored for extended periods. Root vegetables like turnips, carrots and onions could be stored in cool, dark conditions. Some farms had root cellars, underground rooms where vegetables could be kept cold but not frozen. Others simply buried vegetables in sand or earth pits outdoors where they'd stay cold and protected. Cabbage could be fermented into something resembling sauerkraut, which preserved it and added valuable vitamin C to the winter diet. Nuts, when available, were gathered and stored. Hazelnuts were common in some regions. Beech nuts could be collected and used. These provided fat and protein, valuable additions to a winter diet that might otherwise be lacking in calories. Livestock management was a careful balance. You wanted to keep enough animals alive through winter to breed in spring and provide dairy products, wool and labour. But you also had to slaughter animals you couldn't feed. In late autumn, there would be a mass slaughter of animals that had been fattened during the summer. This provided fresh meat for a brief period, but most of it had to be preserved immediately through smoking, salting or drying. The timing was important. Slaughter too early, and you wasted good grazing days. Slaughter too late, and animals might lose weight and condition as food became scarce, giving you less meat. The animals kept alive through winter needed fodder. Hay was cut and dried during summer, then stored in barns or under cover. The amount of hay you managed to put up directly determined how many animals could survive winter. A wet summer where hay moulded or didn't dry properly could doom your livestock. Some animals, particularly sheep and goats, were hardy enough to survive on relatively sparse winter feed, supplemented with whatever they could forage. Cows, being larger and less efficient at converting poor quality feed into nutrition, required more careful management. Some farming communities would bring animals into the longhouse, not just for heat, but to more carefully monitor and ration their food. Fish played an absolutely crucial role in the Viking winter diet. Ice fishing was practiced wherever lakes and rivers froze. You'd cut a hole through the ice and fish through it. A cold and tedious process, but one that could provide fresh protein. Coastal communities relied heavily on fishing, though winter storms made it dangerous. The seas around Scandinavia were rich with cod, herring and other fish species. Preserved fish from autumn catches could be supplemented with whatever could be caught during winter months when weather permitted. Hunting in winter was challenging but possible. Deer, elk and moose were hunted in forested regions. Wild boar were another target. Reindeer hunting was important in the far north. The thick winter snow actually provided opportunities for hunters because it made tracking easier. Fresh snow showed animal tracks clearly. Skis, which allowed hunters to move swiftly through snow while prey struggled through deep drifts, gave hunters a mobility advantage. The Norse god Ulla was associated with both hunting and skiing, which tells you how closely those activities were linked in Viking culture. Smaller game like rabbits, hares, and birds could supplement the diet. Traps and snares could be set and checked without requiring the effort of active hunting. Every bit of protein mattered. Nothing was wasted. If you killed an animal, you used everything. Meat for eating, bones for tools or to make broth, hide for leather, sinew for thread, organs for food or other purposes. Rationing was an essential discipline. You couldn't just eat freely in early winter and hope more food would somehow appear. Every household had to calculate how much food they had, how many people and animals needed to be fed, and how long winter would last. Then you divided food accordingly. Some wealthy families had enough surplus that they could be generous, but most families lived close to the edge. Running out of food in midwinter, with months still to go before spring planting, was a death sentence. The sagas mention winters where people starved because food ran out, or years where early spring came just in time to save communities that were on the verge of collapse. Meals in winter would have been monotonous by our standards. You'd eat preserved fish or meat, porridge made from grain, maybe some dried vegetables if you had them. Fresh food was rare and precious. If someone caught fresh fish or killed game, it was a celebration. Dairy products, when available, added variety. Skyr, butter and cheese could all be made from milk, though milk production dropped significantly in winter as animals had poorer feed and less abundance. Ale and mead were important parts of the winter diet, but not primarily for intoxication. They provided calories. Brewing used grain, water, and in the case of mead, honey. The fermentation process created a drink that was safer than water from questionable sources, more nutritious than plain water, and provided energy from the sugars and alcohols. Ale was consumed daily, though the alcohol content was likely lower than modern beer. Mead, made from fermented honey, was more precious and often reserved for special occasions or wealthier households. The sagas are brutally honest about food scarcity. Characters worry about whether food stores will last. Heroes are praised for their generosity in sharing food with guests or community members in need. Villains are condemned for hoarding food while others starve. The saga of Gisli mentions an outlaw trying to survive winter on the run, catching what food he could while avoiding capture. The desperation of that situation, hunting and foraging while hiding from enemies in brutal weather, illustrates how precarious winter survival could be, even for a capable adult. Hospitality was taken seriously in Viking culture, partly because of this food scarcity. If a traveller showed up at your door in winter, you fed them and gave them shelter. This wasn't just kindness. It was a cultural expectation backed by social pressure and, in some regions, by law. The next time someone in your family was travelling and needed help, you wanted to know that others would extend the same courtesy. But hospitality also put strain on your food stores. More people meant dividing rations further, which is why some laws specified that if a shelter was full, a lottery could determine who had to leave, and refusing to participate could result in fines if someone died as a result. Food preparation was constant work. Grain had to be ground into flour using hand mills, heavy stone querns that required significant effort to operate. Meat and fish had to be soaked to remove salt, then cooked. Porridge had to be stirred. Bread had to be baked. Water had to be fetched and heated. All of this was done with open fires and basic tools. There were no refrigerators to preserve leftovers, no stoves with controlled temperatures, no convenience foods. Every meal was labour-intensive. The nutritional reality of winter diet was that it was heavy on protein and carbohydrates, but could be lacking in fresh vitamins, particularly vitamin C. This likely led to scurvy in some cases, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency that causes weakness, bleeding gums, and if severe enough, death. Preserved foods, fermented dairy, and any wild plants or herbs that could be gathered would have helped, but winter was nutritionally challenging. People emerged from winter thinner, weaker, and eager for the fresh greens and foods that spring would bring. Spiritually and psychologically, food in winter had significance beyond mere nutrition. Feasts, even modest ones by modern standards, were important social events. Sharing food reinforced community bonds. The Yule feast, which we'll discuss more later, was a midwinter celebration that involved communal eating and drinking, a brief abundance in the midst of scarcity. These feasts weren't just about consuming calories, they were about maintaining morale, celebrating survival, and strengthening the social fabric that held communities together through harsh times. Winter in the Viking world meant that outdoor work largely came to a halt, but that didn't mean people were idle. The longhouse became a hive of activity, a workshop, a social centre, and a space where crucial skills were practiced and taught. For women, winter was dominated by textile work. We've talked about clothing production, but the scale of this work deserves emphasis. Producing enough clothing, bedding, and textiles for a household was a year-round job that intensified in winter, when women couldn't be doing outdoor agricultural work. At any given moment in a longhouse, you'd likely see multiple women engaged in different stages of textile production. One might be carding wool, pulling the fibres through combs to align them. Another would be spinning, using a drop spindle to turn carded wool into yarn. A third might be weaving at the loom, creating fabric from spun yarn. A fourth might be sewing, using bone or iron needles to turn fabric into clothing, repair damaged garments, or create household textiles like blankets and wall hangings. The vertical loom was a permanent fixture in most longhouses. It stood against a wall, taking up significant space. The loom consisted of a wooden frame with vertical warp threads weighted at the bottom by loom weights, usually stones or ceramic weights, with holes drilled through them. The weaver would sit or stand at the loom, passing the weft thread horizontally through the warp, building up fabric row by row. This was skilled work that required attention and practice. The tension of the threads had to be maintained. The spacing had to be consistent. A good weaver could produce fabric with over 120 threads per inch, which is finer than some modern machine-woven cloth. Archaeological finds of Viking textiles show craftsmanship that rivals anything from more advanced medieval civilizations. Tablet weaving was another textile technique, used to create narrow decorative bands. This involved threading cards or tablets and twisting them to create complex patterns. The resulting bands could trim clothing, create straps for bags or purses, or add decoration to various items. Skilled weavers could create intricate geometric patterns, animal motifs, or even representational images in these bands. Nalbinding, the precursor to knitting, was used to create socks, mittens, hats, and other items that needed to be stretchy and form-fitting. The technique involved using a single thread and a blunt needle to loop and link stitches, creating a fabric that was dense, warm, and flexible. Modern experiments with nail binding show that items made this way are incredibly durable, often outlasting knitted equivalents, because the structure of the stitches means that a single break doesn't unravel the entire garment. Spinning was work that could be done while sitting, walking, or even while engaged in other tasks. Many women became so proficient that they could spin while supervising children, chatting with neighbours, or listening to stories, their hands working automatically to create yarn from raw wool. The constant need for thread meant that spinning was truly never-ending work. You'd spin thread for weaving fabric for clothes, you'd spin thread for sewing those clothes, you'd spin thread for nail-binding socks and mittens, you'd spin thread for embroidery decoration. The demand was constant, and meeting it required hours of labour every day. For men, winter indoor work involved different tasks. Tool maintenance and creation was important. Wooden tools like spades, ploughs, rakes, and other farming implements that had been used hard during the growing season needed repair or replacement. Men would carve new tool handles, shape wooden implements, and prepare everything for the next farming season. This wasn't light work. Using just a knife, an axe, and maybe a few specialised carving tools, a skilled woodworker could create complex items. Archaeological finds show the sophistication of Viking woodworking. Carved bowls, decorative items, tool handles with animal head terminals, even intricate carved panels for ships or buildings. Weapon maintenance was another male task. Swords, spears, axes and shields all needed care. Iron blades had to be cleaned, sharpened and oiled to prevent rust. Wooden shield boards needed checking for cracks or warping. Leather straps and handles needed repair or replacement. For men who were warriors or who might need to defend the household, keeping weapons in good condition was essential. The famous pattern-welded swords made by forge welding together strips of different types of iron and steel to create blades with distinctive patterns and superior strength required specialized knowledge and skill to maintain. Sharpening such a blade incorrectly could ruin it. Metalworking was practiced by those with the skills. Blacksmiths had forges where they could heat iron and work it into tools, weapons, nails and other essential items, bronze working, silver working and even gold working for those with access to precious metals, created jewellery, brooches, decorative items and trade goods. The techniques involved were sophisticated: casting, forging, repoussé work, filigree and inlay. The beautiful brooches and jewellery that archaeologists find in Viking graves weren't mass-produced imports. They were crafted by skilled metalworkers, often during the winter months when outdoor work was impossible. Ship maintenance, while difficult to do in full winter, could be prepared for. Vikings would discuss needed repairs, gather materials, and plan modifications to ships that would be implemented in spring when weather allowed. Tar production was important. Pine tar was used to waterproof ships, preserve ropes, and protect wood. The process of making tar involved burning pine wood in controlled conditions to extract the tar, which was then collected and stored. This was work that could be done in winter and provided a valuable product for the coming sailing season. Storytelling was perhaps the most culturally important winter activity. The long dark nights were perfect for gathering around the fire and listening to tales. The Vikings had an oral tradition where stories were passed down through generations, not by writing them down, but by memorizing and reciting them. The people who did this professionally were called skalds. Skalds were poets and storytellers who could recite complex narratives, compose new verses, and preserve the history and mythology of their culture. The stories told in Viking longhouses range from creation myths about the gods to hero sagas about legendary warriors. They included family histories, accounts of famous battles, and cautionary tales about honourable and dishonourable behaviour. The Icelandic sagas, which were eventually written down in the 13th century, preserve many of these oral narratives. When you read about Ragnar Lothbrok's adventures, or the settlement of Iceland, or feuds between families that lasted generations, you're reading stories that were first told around winter fires in smoky longhouses centuries before anyone wrote them down. The act of storytelling served multiple purposes. It was entertainment in a time before books, television, or any form of recorded media. It was education, teaching children and young people about their history and cultural values. It was social bonding, bringing the community together in a shared experience. And it was memory preservation, ensuring that knowledge, history and culture survived from one generation to the next. Skalds were highly valued. A skilled skald could travel from hall to hall, welcomed and rewarded for their ability to entertain and inform. They could compose praise poetry for chieftains, immortalizing their deeds. They could settle disputes by reciting family genealogies that established who had rights to what land. Their memory and skill with language made them powerful figures despite not being warriors or landowners. The poetry they composed followed strict forms with complex rules about metre, alliteration, and kennings, which were metaphorical phrases used to describe things. A sword might be called wound snake or battle light. A ship was a wave steed. Learning to compose and recite this poetry required years of training and a formidable memory. Music was another winter pastime. Vikings used various instruments: wooden flutes, pipes, lyres, stringed instruments somewhat like small harps, and drums. Archaeological finds have uncovered fragments of musical instruments, and experimental reconstructions have shown what Viking music might have sounded like. Songs and drinking chants would accompany feasting. Some music was purely for entertainment, while other songs had ritual or ceremonial purposes. Games and competitions helped pass the time and kept skills sharp. Board games were popular. Hnefatafl, often called Viking chess, though it was quite different from modern chess, was a strategy game played on a wooden board with bone or wood pieces. The rules have been reconstructed from archaeological finds and literary descriptions. The game simulated a raid. One side had a king piece that tried to escape to the edge of the board while the other side tried to capture it. It required strategic thinking and planning, skills that were valuable in warfare and daily life. Dice games involved chance but also gambling, which Vikings enjoyed. Betting on dice games, wrestling matches or other competitions was common. The stakes could be anything from small items to significant amounts of silver or valuable goods. Physical competitions, when weather allowed outdoor activity, included wrestling, tests of strength and various contests. The sagas frequently mention wrestling matches, both friendly competitions and more serious challenges that could settle disputes. Swimming competitions were held, even in very cold water, with contests to see who could stay underwater longest or swim furthest. These weren't just for fun. They were training for physical skills that might be needed in emergencies. Ice skating was hugely popular. Vikings made ice skates from animal bones, usually the long bones from horses or cows. The bone was polished smooth on one side and attached to regular shoes with leather straps. You'd push yourself along the ice using a stick, much like modern Nordic skating. Ice skating wasn't just recreation. It was practical transportation across frozen lakes and rivers, allowing travel and communication between communities that would otherwise be isolated by winter. Skiing was similarly important. Skis allowed movement through deep snow, essential for winter hunting and travel. The god Ulla was associated with skiing, hunting and archery, showing how central these skills were. Children learned to ski young, and proficiency was expected. Modern Scandinavia's dominance in Winter Olympic sports isn't accidental. There's a cultural tradition going back over 1,000 years of skiing as a normal, necessary skill. Snowball fights and winter combat games were popular among children. Kids would build snow forts and attack them, learning military tactics and teamwork while playing. The medieval Norwegian historian Olaus Magnus documented these activities in his 16th century work, describing elaborate snowfort battles where children would form teams, build defensive positions, and engage in what was basically a training ground for warfare using snowballs instead of weapons. The skills learned, teamwork, defensive strategy, and aggressive assault tactics, would serve them later in life. Winter was also a time for craft production that required extended periods of focused work. Carving bone and antler into combs, needles, gaming pieces, and decorative items was winter work. The materials, often from animals butchered in autumn, were available. The time to do detailed work was available. Archaeological finds of bone combs show incredible detail. Decorative patterns, animal motifs, runic inscriptions, all carved into objects measuring just a few inches. These weren't just functional items, they were works of art. Leather working continued in winter. Tanning hides was a long process that actually benefited from cold weather in some stages. Creating leather goods, shoes, belts, bags, scabbards for weapons required skill and time. The leather had to be cut, stitched, and sometimes decorated with tooling or dye. A skilled leatherworker could produce items that were both functional and beautiful. For children, winter was a time of learning. Boys learned men's skills by watching and helping their fathers and older male relatives. Girls learned women's work from their mothers and female relatives. Formal education, as we understand it, didn't exist. Learning happened through observation, practice, and oral instruction. A child would watch an adult spin wool, then try it themselves under supervision. They'd watch someone carve a spoon from wood, then attempt it with guidance and correction. Laws and legal matters were also discussed during winter. Communities couldn't hold their formal assemblies, called things, in the depth of winter because travel was difficult, but informal dispute resolution and legal discussions happened in longhouses. Elders would advise younger people on proper behaviour. Conflicts would be mediated before they escalated into feuds. Legal knowledge was passed down orally, and people who could recite laws and precedents were valued. Religion and ritual practices continued through winter. Sacrifices to the gods, prayers for protection, and various observances mark the passage of time. The winter solstice, celebrated as Yule, which we'll explore in detail, was the major winter religious festival. But smaller observances throughout the dark months reminded people that the gods were watching, that cycles would continue, and that spring would eventually return. The psychological challenge of winter confinement shouldn't be underestimated. Modern people who experience seasonal affective disorder understand how darkness and confinement can affect mood and mental health. Vikings dealt with the same challenges without understanding the biochemical causes. The activities, storytelling, games, crafts served not just practical purposes but helped maintain morale and mental health. Keeping busy, maintaining social bonds and having communal activities helped people endure months of darkness without descending into depression or conflict. This wasn't idle time, it was productive time, different from summer's agricultural labour but no less important. The skills practiced, the items crafted, the stories told, and the social bonds maintained during winter were what allowed Viking society to function. When spring came and outdoor work resumed, people had new tools, repaired equipment, clothing ready for the coming year, and a community that had been strengthened by surviving another winter together. In the very depths of winter, when darkness was heaviest and cold most brutal, the Vikings celebrated. Yule, or Jol in Old Norse, was the midwinter festival, a celebration of the winter solstice that marked the longest night of the year, and more importantly the return of the sun. This wasn't just a party, it was a cultural and spiritual cornerstone, a time when communities came together to feast, honour the gods and ancestors, and affirm their determination to survive until spring's return. The timing of Yule is somewhat debated among scholars. The winter solstice itself occurs around December 21st in our modern calendar, but Snorri Sturluson, writing in the 13th century about earlier Viking traditions, mentions that Yule began on midwinter night and lasted for 3 days. Some scholars believe the celebration started at the full moon following the winter solstice, which could place it anywhere from early January to early February. Others argue that it coincided with the solstice itself. Regardless of the exact dates, Yule was timed to the darkest period of winter, a defiant celebration of light and life in the midst of death and darkness. The symbolism of Yule was powerful. The sun was being reborn. The days, which had been growing shorter and shorter, would now begin to lengthen, even if imperceptibly at first. This astronomical reality was understood by the Vikings, who tracked celestial movements carefully. The return of the sun meant hope for spring, for planting, for growth and renewal. It meant the cycle was continuing, that the world hadn't frozen into permanent winter, that life would go on. Yule celebrations involved several key elements. Feasting was central. This was the time to slaughter animals that had been saved for this purpose and to break into preserved foods that had been stored specifically for the celebration. Archaeological evidence and saga descriptions tell us about massive feasts where entire communities would gather in the largest longhouse available and consume quantities of food and drink that would seem excessive any other time. Roasted meats, particularly pork from wild boar or domesticated pigs, were traditional. The boar was sacred to Freyr, the Norse god of fertility and abundance, and sacrificing or consuming boar at Yule was a way of honouring him and asking for his blessing for the coming year's harvest. Drinking was equally important, and not just for intoxication. King Haakon the Good of Norway, who ruled in the mid-10th century, was a Christian but allowed his subjects to remain pagan. He did, however, require that everyone celebrate a midwinter feast, whether they called it Christmas or Yule. According to the saga of Håkon the Good, he even specified minimum drinking requirements. Every free man had to consume approximately 4 gallons of ale over 3 nights. This sounds absurd, until you remember that ale was lower in alcohol than modern beer and served as a major source of calories and nutrition. The drinking wasn't primarily about getting drunk. It was about communal consumption, shared abundance, and honouring the gods through offerings of ale and mead. Mead, fermented honey wine, was the prestige drink. It was more expensive than ale and often reserved for special occasions. Toasts were made to the gods. Odin, the All-Father and god of wisdom and war. Thor, the protector god associated with thunder and strength. Freya, god of fertility and prosperity. And Freya, goddess of love and magic. Raising a drinking horn and making formal toasts to the gods wasn't casual socializing. It was a religious act, a way of acknowledging their power and asking for their continued favour. Oath-taking was another Yule tradition. Vikings took their oath seriously. An oath was a binding commitment, not something made lightly. But oaths sworn during Yule were considered especially sacred. Some sources describe placing your hand on a boar, the sacred animal of Freyr, while making your oath. The sagas are full of stories about oaths made at Yule that then drove the plot of the entire narrative. A man might swear to marry a specific woman, to avenge an insult, to accomplish some heroic deed, or to uphold a promise. These weren't New Year's resolutions that you forgot about by February. They were ironclad commitments that you were expected to fulfill or die trying. The central conflicts of many sagas revolve around someone making an ill-considered Yule oath and then having to deal with the consequences. The Yule log was a significant tradition. A large oak or ash log would be selected and brought into the longhouse with ceremony. The log was burned in the hearth, ideally for the entire 12 days of Yule, though in practice keeping a single log burning that long was difficult. The burning log symbolised the warmth of the sun, the light returning to the world, and the fire that kept the household safe from the cold and darkness. The ashes from the Yule log were saved and scattered in fields or kept as protective charms. They were believed to bring good luck, fertility to crops, and protection against evil spirits. The Yule goat is a more mysterious tradition. In Norse mythology, Thor rode across the sky in a chariot pulled by 2 goats. The goat became associated with Yule celebrations, though exactly how is unclear from the limited sources we have. In later Scandinavian tradition, straw goats were made as decorations, a custom that survives today in Sweden, where the gavel goat, a massive straw goat erected in the town square each December, is a famous Christmas tradition. Some scholars think the Yule goat may have originally been connected to processions or gift-giving, a figure who visited houses during the festival. The wild hunt was believed to ride during Yule. This was a ghostly procession led by Odin, who had the name Yolnir, meaning Yule figure. The wild hunt swept through the winter sky, collecting the souls of the dead and possibly portending doom for those who saw it. Children would leave offerings of food for Odin's 8-legged horse, Sleipnir, much like modern children leaving cookies for Santa Claus. The connection isn't coincidental. Many scholars believe that the figure of Santa Claus or Father Christmas evolved partly from Odin and the Yule traditions, filtered through centuries of Christian reinterpretation. Gift-giving during Yule was practiced, though it looked different from modern Christmas. Gifts were typically practical items, tools, weapons, jewellery, clothing, or crafted goods. They weren't wrapped in decorative paper. They were presented openly as gestures of generosity and social bonding. Gift-giving reinforced alliances, showed wealth and status, and created obligations of reciprocity. If someone gave you a valuable gift, you were expected to remember it and return the favour in the future. This system of gift exchange and obligation helped maintain social order and community cohesion. Mistletoe had significance in Norse mythology. The god Balder, associated with light and beauty, was killed by an arrow made from mistletoe. His mother, Frigg, wept for him, and her tears became the white berries of the mistletoe plant. Balder was eventually resurrected, making mistletoe a symbol of death, rebirth, and the hope that what is lost can be regained. Hanging mistletoe during Yule connected to these myths, and represented the promise that even in the darkest time, resurrection and renewal were possible. Evergreen trees and branches were brought indoors and used for decoration. In the harsh Scandinavian winter, evergreens remained green when everything else had died or gone dormant. They represented endurance, the continuation of life, and the promise of spring. Vikings believed that spirits inhabited trees, particularly evergreens, and bringing branches indoors honoured these spirits and invited their blessings into the household. This tradition evolved into the Christmas tree custom that spread across the world, but its roots are in pagan Yule celebrations where evergreen boughs were sacred and magical. The connection to the dead and ancestors was strong during Yule. Vikings believed that the barriers between the world of the living and the realm of the dead grew thin during the darkest time of year. Ghosts and spirits could cross over more easily. Draugr, the walking dead from Norse folklore, were more active. Families would leave offerings of food and drink for their deceased ancestors, honouring them and asking for their protection and guidance. This wasn't morbid or frightening in the way we might think of ghosts. Ancestors were part of the family, and their continued presence in the spiritual world was acknowledged and respected. Yule was also a time for divination and seeing the future. Some traditions involved rituals where people would attempt to glimpse what the coming year held. Water was considered sacred during this time, and some communities performed divinations near lakes or rivers. The idea was that the boundary between worlds being thin allowed glimpses not just into the realm of the dead, but into the future as well. The festival lasted for multiple days, traditionally 12, which gives us the 12 days of Christmas in the modern carol. During this time, normal work was suspended as much as possible. People rested, celebrated, ate, drank, told stories, played games, and reinforced their community bonds. It was a break from the grinding labour and scarcity of winter, a moment of abundance and joy in the midst of hardship. For communities living on the edge of survival, Yule served crucial psychological and social functions. It broke up the endless monotony of winter. It gave people something to look forward to and prepare for. It reinforced social hierarchies and bonds through feasting, gift-giving, and communal celebration. It connected people to their gods and ancestors through ritual and sacrifice. And it reminded everyone that the cycles continued, that winter would end, that spring would come, that survival was possible. The modern Christmas holiday, especially as celebrated in Scandinavia and parts of Northern Europe, retains many Yule elements. The Yule log became a Christmas tradition, though now it's more likely to be a chocolate dessert than an actual burning log. The decorated evergreen tree, mistletoe, feasting, gift-giving, and the 12 days of celebration all have roots in pre-Christian Yule customs. When Christianity spread through Scandinavia, it didn't erase these traditions. Instead, they were adapted and incorporated into Christmas, creating a hybrid celebration that preserved ancient customs while giving them new Christian meanings. Understanding Yule helps us understand the Viking relationship with winter. They didn't just endure it, they marked its passage with celebration, honouring the darkest time as sacred and finding reasons for joy even when conditions were harshest. The feast in the midst of scarcity, the light of the Yule log in the deepest darkness, the oaths and gift-giving that reinforced community bonds, all of these things helped Vikings not just survive winter, but maintain their culture and identity through it. Winter in Viking times was brutal, demanding and relentless. It tested every aspect of survival: your ability to stay warm, your food stores, your mental resilience, and your community bonds. The cold was real, the darkness was oppressive, the scarcity was life-threatening. But the Vikings met winter not with despair, but with preparation, ingenuity, and cultural practices that transformed survival into something more than mere existence. They built longhouses that sheltered extended families and livestock, creating communal warmth in the face of brutal cold. They dressed in carefully crafted layers of wool and fur that protected them from the elements. They developed sophisticated food preservation techniques and rationing practices that stretched autumn's abundance through winter's scarcity. They filled the long dark nights with storytelling, craft work, games, and social activities that maintained morale and passed down skills and knowledge through generations. And at the darkest point, they celebrated. Yule wasn't a denial of winter's harshness. It was an acknowledgement of it, and a declaration that even in the midst of death and darkness, life, community, and hope would endure. When spring finally came, as it always did, the Vikings emerged from their longhouses thinner, perhaps, and certainly eager for warmth and fresh food, but also strengthened by the ordeal. Winter had tested them and found them capable. The skills they'd practiced, the bonds they'd maintained, and the determination they'd forged during those dark months were what made them the people who would go on to explore, trade, raid, and leave their mark across the medieval world. So when you think about Vikings now, don't just picture warriors on longships. Picture families huddled around a fire on a winter night, wool in hand, working by flickering light, while someone recites the saga of a hero from generations past. Picture children learning to ski, hunters tracking deer through snow, women weaving the cloth that would become next year's clothing. Picture the Yule feast, the toasting, the oaths, the celebration of survival and community in the deepest cold. That was winter in Viking times. And understanding it, really understanding what it took to survive and even thrive through those months, gives us a new appreciation for just how remarkable these people were. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Viking winter life, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There's so much more to explore about how people in the past lived, survived, and created the cultures that shaped our world. What aspect of Viking life would you like to see covered next? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.